Welcome to Le Arte dell'Arme, the Bolognese podcast, where we discuss the intricacies of the Bolognese tradition with the practitioners, translators, authors, and teachers working to bring the art back to life. Today's guest is Pike Pullen. Pike began his HEMA journey in 2014 with Swordwind historical swordsmanship under Eric Lowe. Originally focusing on early KDF sources, they transitioned to primarily studying the Bolognese text, focusing on two-handed sword, sword alone, sword, and buckler. They also frequently dabble in heresy and dive into a little bit of Godinho from time to time. Mike, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. You have always been one of my favorite fencers to watch. I think in an earlier podcast I mentioned probably one of the most epic fights that I've ever witnessed between you and Chris Nolan at Lord Baltimore's challenge in the semifinal, and it was one of the most like technically proficient fights that I've ever seen in my entire life.
It was a really hard fight. It was a really hard
fight. He's a great fencer, and then and then you proceeded to just destroy me in the third place match. So
now I see it's really his fault. He got me all warmed up. You know, he took me to that next level up above, and I was pretty much I was upset and I was ready for anything at that point. So. That was such a hard match. It's one of the matches I think about. That one and my one with David Biggs I think about a lot. It's because they're really good. Like some of my favorites. So.
Yeah, they really were. And, I mean, like I had like the toughest slot ever because I had to fight David Rowe and then I had to fight you.
Yeah, actually, David, I've never fought David. I've always wanted to fight him. He's on my like bucket list of people I want to fence and sword buckler like all the time. It just never works out.
It's scary because it's like his proficiency is just like he just doesn't make mistakes. So you really have to work to open him up and get something on him.
What's cool about David is I feel like he really enjoys what he does too. Like I feel like he's always like super happy when he fences, even when he's like upset. I feel like he's like super enjoying the moment. You know, like I've seen him get a little frustrated before, but he still looks like he's having a good time solving the problem of whoever he's fencing. So.
Yeah, for sure. So tell me a little bit about your martial arts background and how you got started in the Bolognese system.
So my martial arts background, so like a lot of people, I wrestled in high school, which is pretty fun, but I played a lot of sports in high school, so I'm not sure I'd really count that as martial arts, but I think kind of physical activities all contribute to other physical activities. But after that, I kind of got into Chinese martial arts for a while. And I studied some Southern Chinese Kung Fu and then some Northern Chinese Kung Fu and studied some Swai Jiao wrestling for a little while and even a little Tai Chi for a little while. And then I kind of got tired of all that because I really wanted to play with swords. And it was kind of interesting. Actually, I saw... I think I've told this story to a few people, but so I kind of found out about HEMA through the New York Times. They had like this article / video like that happened, and I was like, "What is this? I really want to do this." And then I started like looking around, and there was nothing near me, so I was a little disheartened. But then I posted on at the time there were some HEMA forums at the time, and I forget what they were called. But I had reached out, and actually Ben responded to me telling me that Eric was moving down to Charlotte and that I should reach out to him. And then poor Eric moved down here, and literally like 2 weeks later, I was bothering him to start up and trying to get him to come to sword fighting with me to go fence a bit. So I felt bad. I always felt a little bad about that. He never really got a chance to settle in. It was literally like he got here, he got his family here, and then boom, I was like, hey, let's go do some things. It was a good time. And then, so that started, we were doing KDF, or like early KDF for about 4 years. And I had a good time doing that. But I kept having questions about why are we doing some of these things? And it really wasn't answering the questions for me. And then right around this time, Ilka started releasing some cool videos and Bolognese stuff, and I was like, "Oh, I want to do that." And then we kind of went from there. And so I actually looked the other day, realized that I've been doing Bolognese stuff for 4 years as of like this month or last month. so,
Nice.
I've been doing I did KDF for 4 years, and I've done Bolognese for 4 years now. And
So
it's been...
where does that put you? I guess that makes you Swiss.
you know, I'll take it. You know, I'm alright with that.
Yeah, that's awesome.
That's yep.
So you, I mean, overall, you know, since you've been studying the Bolognese system for 4 years, which, you know, in terms of longevity as a Bolognese practitioner is actually pretty impressive, because since you've started for the Bolognese system 4 years ago, you kind of started in like the dark ages of the Bolognese, you know, sort of the development of what we now see as, you know, kind of sources being available and information being out there. You know, you talked about looking at Ilka videos, and I think that's kind of where a lot of us started. And it was kind of, you know, piecing stuff together to try to do Bolognese at the time. But as you've kind of progressed through, are there any authors or sort of systems that you find yourself more akin to?
Yeah, no, I think we should probably step back from that a little bit, because I don't really feel like 4 years ago was really the dark ages of Bolognese fencing. I did it first. Like, I kind of felt like, oh, this is something new that no one had really touched on. But as I've gotten into it, I've realized that like there's kind of like a group and a half that was really kind of diving into it even before me. You know, you've got like Greg Mele, he's been looking at Bolognese stuff obviously longer than I have. Devin Borman has, David Biggs as well. And I didn't even realize that for a long time until I had taken some seminars and classes from them. That like that's kind of a little bit longer. Like, I mean, even if you look back at the Mancellino translation, you know, Tom was working on that for a long time too, and kind of working through that. You know, so there is a little bit of like before even 4 years ago, people were like really kind of starting to dive into this, which I think is really cool. There are other couple like really awful translations that were floating around also that I feel like someone did a long time ago. There's like a really old Marazzo translation that's not really great, but it was really good at the time. I mean, it was like the minute the new Mr. Swanger translation came out, that thing's was like one of my pride and joys, maybe my most abused book.
Yep.
But to answer your actual question, I would say probably identify the most with Delagoki and probably secondarily Mancellino. I think those two authors really provide the most, I don't know, holistic view of fencing of the period.
Yeah.
Which is kind of cool.
Yeah, I agree with that, because they kind of take it and condense it down into its necessary and constituent parts. Like, that's how I feel about them. Like, Marazzo and Anonimo are very much about the continuation of plays and sort of like developing third, fourth intentions, and Mancellino and Delagoki kind of teach you how to get there, how to start that.
Yeah, they do a good job of telling you what you can do, right? This is like if I define a lot of my day by like verbs and nouns, and if I were to say it, I would say that they do a great job of telling you what is possible. Maybe to like a really uncomfortable amount of how much they can tell you what to do, just because there's so much volume there. And then the Anonimo is kind of like very similar. There's like hundreds of plays in the Anonimo, and that's a really hard text to consume, which is why I've kind of been putting it off. It kind of intimidates me a little bit.
Yeah.
But
No,
I know there's some people working through it, but what were you saying, sir?
Oh no, I was gonna say I'm in the same boat. Yeah, I started into the Anonimo and I got like 30 plays in, and then I was like, this is way too much.
It's
I
yeah, it's huge. I still can't believe that Stephen translated the thing. It's
know.
that thing is truly a labor of love. It is like that's got to be one of the hardest, or maybe one of the longest translations I've seen put out in a long time. This is
Yeah, it's
so much.
It's incredible. Yeah. Yeah, so you were talking a little bit about Mancilino, and I know just recently you were kind of working on going back through Mancilino's attacks and defenses, well, sort of, I guess, counters to his attacks in the first part, and doing that with two-handed sword. Tell me a little bit about that and what you kind of found as you were exploring that material.
So something I've actually tried to do is both with Mancilino and Delagogi is to work through the plays and see like just like all the defenses and some of the other provocation plays with weapons besides just a side sword. There is some there is some dialogue in some of the manuals, the books talking about how this is a thing, right? Like all this, like if you look at Marazzo, he'll talk about like some of the sword and buckler stuff is good with any weapon. Um, and there's some allusions to that in all the other books if it's not explicit. I can't remember if Mancilino calls that out explicitly. I actually think he does, but I'd have to go look it up. And I was like, I'm going to try it out. I think between Delagoki and Mancilino, I think Mancilino is probably the most comfortable to do with other weapons, like two-handed weapons. And I think Delagoki comes in a close second. I think some of the inverted, like Guardia de Testa with Delagoki gets a little bit harder with a two-handed sword. It's just a little less comfortable. Where I think Mancilino doesn't really put you in that position as often.
Yeah, so to like your first point, I think what you're thinking about is in his introduction, he mentions the two-handed sword and says that, and there's also like the two-handed sword, but I'm not going to cover that here, but I think he says something along the lines of like these plays translate, or you can use these basic principles to understand the two-handed sword or something to that degree. I might be misremembering that, but I think that's what he
I
says.
think that's the gist, right? I think these guys are like presenting literally like a kind of and I hate to say it this way because it sounds almost derogatory, but a more generic way of like presenting fencing to someone, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Like, and I think they're afforded a lot of benefit by having access, like easier access to like printing, so they can have a lot more words, so things are a little more descriptive, and so it's kind of cool that they give so much. Um, and but I also think, like I said, they're a little generic, right? So a lot of their stuff is kind of just, I'm like, I could pick this up with any weapon and do this with with anything. But I think that's
yeah.
kind of the point. I think that's kind of the point, right? These guys ran pretty big schools. When you get to a certain size of teaching, you kind of normalize your curriculum, just to make it easier on
Yeah.
everyone.
Yeah. So what does that mean for the Anonymous? I guess he was probably just like out there studying by himself, like lone sword, just like traveling around Italy, just, messing people up,
You know what
writing down all of his thoughts.
the Anonymous messes up mostly modern people trying to read that book, right? I think it's a great book. It's so hard to go through. Have you worked through the Anonymous at all? Really? You said you worked for the first 30 plays or so.
Yeah, I got up to about 30 plays, and then I kind of backed off because I was trying to, like trying to do them as a form in individual training.
Mm-hmm.
That's really kind of how I started the pandemic because we got
Right.
we got the Anonymous translation from Stephen just like right before we went into lockdown. So much of it was kind of trying to develop those interpretations kind of in isolation.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I just got bored with it. I don't know. It's Mancilino's fault. I started going through Mancilino's sword and large buckler stuff, and I fell in love, and I was like, wow, this is actually really fascinating. And then I started teaching a class on Mancilino's sword and large buckler. So
I think the sword and large buckler material in both Mancilino and Marazzo is some of the best material on sword and buckler, honestly.
hands down.
Hands down. Like it's like it's it takes away all the, like, I think the more fun, like, workout kind of plays that you get in the earlier section. That kind of is like, this is how we're gonna fight.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
Which
you're using a sharp sword. I mean, they're explicit about the fact that
right.
you're using a sharp sword and that you're kind of fighting in earnest, or at least fighting with a sense of danger. And so you go from buckler beating and like, big swooping cuts to everything's super tight and direct.
Yeah, not to like like, so a lot of the stuff in the large buckler also exists in the small buckler, but like you said, right, a lot of that flourish is like just omitted, which I'm sure bothers some people. I know some people really like the flourishy stuff, and I go through phases where I'm like really into looking about as fancy as I can be, right? But you know, when I'm preparing for like an event, I'm like, let's go thumb through the large buckler material and kind of like brush up on this a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean it's kind of interesting, like how when you were kind of going through and developing your interpretations for sort of transmitting Manciolino's advice to like longsword and stuff like that. Like take the like the I don't know, like Guardia Alta, for example. So one of the things that I'm actually teaching my students now is all the attacks from Guardia Alta. So a lot of times you'll start with like a falso to the hand, or well, I mean, I guess he just says a falso, and then he goes in and you proceed with like a mandrito, and then he's got a follow-up play where you feint the mandrito and then cut a reverso. How do you usually kind of take those plays and then sort of transmit them to longsword?
Um, almost exactly like it sounds. So,
Yeah.
right. So, like, if you look at the first part, right, there's really like a couple different ways you can deliver that falso, right? Like, if you're in Guardia Alta, the sword can travel behind you through destreza and then come back up. And sometimes that works, right?
Yeah.
It's the kind of thing you can do when you're in the wide measure, right, and you're kind of just feeling out your opponent. You can do this action pretty safely.
Yeah, it works better with a buckler doing that, the sort of rising falso.
I
Yeah.
think most of the offline guards work better with a buckler, right? Or even with an offhand weapon, because that offhand weapon does provide like a little bit of a threat or protection, just whatever it is, right? But there's obviously other ways to throw falsos, right? Like in my mind, there
Yeah.
are anyway, right? You can throw a descending falso, or even more of like a Zwerkow, like from if you're to steal a German term. There's lots of ways to do this, and what's interesting is a lot of them work regardless in my mind, right? I feel like those tighter versions, right, like just like a descending false edge cut or the Zwerkow cuts tend to work a lot better when you're closer to someone. Like if I am closer, if someone starts to encroach on me, swinging back behind me to get the falso, like is just a much larger tempo that I'm generally not wanting to expose. But when I relay this to my students, I try to be really honest about it. Honestly, I say this. I say like, sometimes when you're far away, you can get away with one, and when we get closer, you can kind of get away with another. Now, as to the actual intent, I honestly have no answer for that because they're not quite that descriptive. But when I relay this information to my students, I kind of tell them to just be as honest as they can be with their interpretations. Understand that there are differences and there are benefits to both because we don't have those details, right? I'm honestly not too sure that they, like, if I were talking to the masters, they would care too much either. I feel like a lot of that stuff is kind of more basic fencing, and I feel like their obsession with controlling that wide and narrow measure and understanding how to behave in both is really important to them in general. So
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree with that. So, kind of taking the plays, trying to suss out the lesson and try to understand things more from the context of, what's the purpose of a specific action and its context. So like, for Manciolino in particular, thinking, okay, if you're going to enter with a falso, it's probably going to be to a shallow target, followed by your mandrito, which is a feint based on how your opponent parries, and then your reverso if they do parry, right? Kind of just thinking about that from context, linearly working in on your opponent.
that's exactly it, right? Like I think when we think about weapons and their use, right? Like rarely in history does someone build like some generic weapon. Like all weapons kind of have their purpose and their niche, and I think a lot of these abilities and techniques that they describe literally have their use and their purpose. Like this is what this is for, and you just have to kind of like suss out like the right one for the right moment. But I think that's kind of all fencing, especially when you're doing interpretation fencing. And while the Bolognese are really good about this, they're not perfect. They're definitely better than the earlier sources, but they're not nearly as explicit as they are in like later rapier sources, for example.
Yeah, that's true. So, I mean, one of the things that you brought up earlier when you were talking about the KDF sources is how you were kind of questioning, like you were looking at the system and like, hey, there's something missing here. And I know that we've had conversations in the past about this, but talking about how in KDF sources, it almost feels like the Zufectin isn't addressed, yet the Zufectin kind of represents the Larga plays and the wide play that is prevalent throughout most of the Italian sources. Is that kind of what you were getting at when you were saying that you kind of felt like you were missing something?
I think there's a few things missing in earlier sources, and I don't know if they, I hesitate to offer an answer because I don't think there is an answer.
Gotcha.
I think it's one of those things where I guarantee you they had opinions on it. Like whoever wrote those sources, whichever source you look at, I guarantee you they had opinions on it. Like just because people who fence always have opinions on these things, right? But they don't write it down, so it's either omission by it's intentional omission, right? That wasn't what they were focusing on, right? Either they assumed you had some prior knowledge, or they omitted this because they didn't want you to do it. But for me, I was more interested in that kind of generic. I hate to call it generic, but if it's kind of like if what they're trying to do in earlier KDF is provide material on here is something beyond the mundane, right? This is how these are the extra. This is the extra special sauce that we're going to give you to make you all the more awesome. But I was really more curious at the time. I was like, well, I don't care about that stuff as much. I started caring more about, well, what is the basics recipe for all this fencing. And that's kind of how I got in the Bolognese. And as I've gone through the Bolognese, I find more and more of those kind of early KDF lessons are just kind of a part of the sources. They're just not as explicit. I do feel like the earlier KDF sources are really, really good about teaching you when to do things. They're really bad at teaching you what to do, but they're really good at teaching you when to do things. Their descriptions of like pressure and Fullen, Vor and Knock, I think are really good descriptive values for like trying to offer guidance on when to do something. Like I said, the Bolognese sources are really good at telling you what you can do, right? Like the Bolognese are like, here's a recipe and here are all the techniques to create this dish. And then the KDF sources are more like, and here's where we can add an extra dash of salt, and this is like there's little things like that, and when should we serve this dish? That's what they care about.
Yeah. Well, like, and to that point, I've always said, like, I feel like the word indes is absolutely brilliant in its simplicity, but also its ability, and I guess that's just a German thing, but also in its ability to communicate so many different ideas in one word.
Yeah, it's really great. I mean, if you look about like the, like if we assume that indis means like at the same time, right? Which I think a lot of people kind of assume this. I'm sure someone else has some other interpretation of this. I don't want to tell them that they're right or wrong. If you compare this to like later Italian terminology, it's like, wow, that is a lot more words to express the same idea, guys.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I mean, you could take it, and I mean, there were a couple different times I've played around with designing a class around for KDF students around the word indes, but using tempos and ideas of tempos from Bolognese and rapier sources, and just where I feel like sometimes like the word indes can be almost give this mysterious atmosphere to it, where people are kind of wary of coming to it and trying to really kind of understand it. Trying to fill that in for people and say, hey, listen, here, take Dall'Agocchie's 5 tempos and throw indes in. At any moment, he says, in the moment of, or in, when you've done X, you could throw indes in there and you would have literally all of the tempos And then you pull it back out and you realize that if you just say indes in the moment that they do something, in the moment they take a step, in the moment that you make a parry, in the moment that they chamber their cut, like those are all your tempos of attack. And you think of that and sort of pull that out, you can sort of separate it and then condense it back down into that single word. And it's brilliant.
Yeah, it's really good. It's actually it's funny you say this. I've actually I just went to RASP this year for the first time. And part of RASP is like learning about pedagogy and how to teach things, right? It's literally like the whole purpose of it. And they do a pretty good job of being like source agnostic for you, which is good. But one of the things I really realize is they do a really good job of how to teach that kind of material, like from a coaching perspective. Just with setting up the invitations for attacks, like how do you present that information to students and show how to deliver that kind of timing, because some of them are pretty hard, right? Like hitting someone when you're like watching their foot lift, is kind of, I hesitate to say impossible, but it's on the harder level of like doing things, right?
Yeah.
It's more like you're generally looking more, I think, like at their body entirely and wondering if they're coming closer to you or farther away from you, more than you are staring at their foot. Now you can stare at their foot obviously when you're farther away, right? And maybe if you're 6'5" and you have an excellent lunge, that works for you. But for everybody else, the rest of us mere mortals who are a little bit shorter than that, like generally if I'm looking at their foot too close, I'm probably ignoring something else that I really should be wary of.
Right. Like their sword. Yeah.
Like their sword thrusting into my chest or shoulder or something.
Yeah.
Makes it
Yeah.
makes it hard. And then one other thing I found out. Have you ever met Puck Curtis? He's like a really big destreza guy.
I haven't. No.
He was talking. I was talking to him at RASP. Actually, he's one of the fencing coaches there. And there's a source. I think he said it was Ettenhard. And he has this Ettenhard has this really weird play where you basically have someone give you this really big swing, like cut, and you're supposed to attack them like within the middle of that swing. And for a long time, he was like, "Why would anybody teach you to do this attack? Like you're never going to win this." But we started talking about this idea of presenting these big attacks and teaching people to attack you within these big attacks. And then as people get better, those attacks get smaller and smaller, and you teach them to attack you within these smaller tempo, right? That hand moving in preparation for a cut, right? Which is one of the tempos. But yeah, this has actually been on my head a lot lately. I've been really trying to figure out how to teach these better, and I don't hesitate to say it, but I think a lot of later period sources, especially once you start hitting into the classical fencing era, get really good at teaching this kind of material. Totally like a little bit different context and a little bit different weaponry. But really does a good job of I think developing that. It's something I'm trying to convince Eric to try. I think we're going to give it a shot, see how it goes with teaching people some of these things a little bit better. So we'll see how that goes. You can come fence us and let us know how we're doing.
Yeah. I'd love to. Yeah, I mean, I should come down there. I mean, if things are, it has been a while. It's been too long, man. It's been too long. But or you guys can come up for Oktoberfest.
Eric's teaching up there, and then I wasn't originally planning on going, but I may have just freed up my schedule to go. We will see.
Perfect.
My anniversary is like right around that time, so I try to. I would like to celebrate that too. So we'll see if I can have my cake and eat it too. We'll see if I can do
priorities, right? Well, yeah, no. So I mean, you brought up something really interesting because I've always felt like the later sources. I think this is a consequence of just having the printing press, right? Like you have more space to communicate an idea. And I mean, thinking about KDF in particular, kind of going back to how we got to this, like you're talking about a poem that people are basically writing down their thoughts about. And the poem's supposed to convey all of these ideas condensed down into stanzas or phrases or words that are memorable. And that's where I think there's a little bit of brilliance. But I think to really kind of understand that, you do have to kind of look at the later sources and the ideas of later sources. I mean, I know like when Chris was developing our curriculum, we were really looking at tempo and trying to understand tempo. He started with the Bolognese sources and then started looking at things like, I think he really kind of settled on Capoferro and Capoferro's understanding of tempo. And that's primarily what we use.
Yeah, Capoferro's great for that, right? He's kind of
Yeah, he's
like, if
he
we
really
ignore
explains it well.
Giganti, because he's kind of, I think Giganti's kind of, I don't want to call him the weirdo of the group, but he's definitely like the less cool fencer if you look at like Giganti, Capoferro, and Fibris, right? I definitely think Giganti is the weaker one of those masters, right? And
Yeah.
I think there's some mockery too by later masters about him as well, you know. But I really like how Capoferro starts to describe that. I think he does a good job of that.
Well, and for Gigante in particular, he's also like almost deliberately keeping things simple, like sort of the way, we were just talking about with somebody like Dalagoki and Manciolino. It's like they deliberately kind of kept things relatively simple so that way it was easier to teach. And I think that maybe there's a reason why he did it that way. Especially since he comes from a military background, doesn't he? Wasn't he involved in
Yeah, I think
Lepanto or something like that?
I think Giganti was. You'd have to ask someone who's a little more expert on it than I am. I'm only
Yeah.
just familiar with that he was. So but he does have that great picture where he's posing in the front though. So he looks.
Yeah.
He definitely looks like a. He definitely looks like that's like a strict instructor. But
He
but
does,
yeah, no,
yeah.
I agree. I feel like he's definitely trying to present material more simply. Whether he may not have a choice in that matter. I don't know what his actual like accolades are as far as fencing is concerned, or what people then thought of him, for example. I just don't know.
Yeah.
So I'm sure someone does. Someone who
Yeah,
really,
no. Yeah,
really
they're
loves
like that's not, yeah. I've always been a Bolognese guy, so
Yeah,
I dabble every once in a while in the rapier sources, but um, even when I fight with a rapier, I pretty much just do side sword stuff.
well, and I don't know how awful that is. I don't know how. I don't think that's a bad idea, right?
No, I mean, and it,
Like,
it works.
yeah,
So
yeah.
I don't know. People just get a little weird when I start like beating their sword.
Well, it's not just the beat. It's the way in which we beat the sword. It's probably a little more aggressive than is necessary. But, I mean, if you think about it, what we would consider a side sword and what we consider a rapier were like contemporaneous, right? It's not like like everyone just got rid of their side swords one day and we're like, oh, we only have rapiers now.
Yeah.
They existed side by side for a very long time.
Yes, they did.
And
Well,
even shorter rapiers existed for a very long time. Like I just sources that are much later that talk about like the nobility of the shorter rapier, and I'm like, man, that just sounds like a side sword to me, buddy. So
well, maybe they were the holdouts. They were just like,
They're-
yeah, this weapon is so much cooler. I don't know. I mean, so lately I've been looking a lot at Palladini. I've really kind of been working through, and he's pretty interesting because like he does so many, like he is not simple by any means. Like you come in from each of the guards and you pretty much find your opponent's sword, pressure their sword to get like generate the tempo of them doing his falsata. Like you're trying to force this falsata from all four of the principal guards, the Roman guards, in order to do some sort of a crazy like void and thrust. Like it's pretty intense. Like I just like I haven't looked at many of the other rapier sources, so I don't know if this is something that's common in them. And so I might be speaking from a place of arrogance here, since this is really the only like true rapier source I've ever really studied. But I mean, so much of it is like some of the plays, for example, like it's like you come to the inside, you bind heavy on your opponent's sword to force them to do his falsata because they have nothing else to do. And as they do that, you just drop underneath and stab them in the armpit.
yeah, you were talking about this earlier. You when you messaged me earlier, I was like, what play is he talking about? So I had to go pull out my book and go look it up.
Oh yeah, so I was talking about the one where, and this one is
Engage.
like super fascinating, right? So like Terza against Terza.
Okay.
basic Bolognese like setup for this play. You go in, you're in terza, and his terza is pretty much coda lunga stretta, right? So you're right foot forward, you're in coda lunga stretta, but you're just kind of leaning back. You beat to your opponent's sword and feint a thrust. And as they go to parry that thrust, after you've beat their sword, then you drop underneath their sword. I usually do it with a bit of a lean back, and then come back with the false edge over top of their sword and just wind up into a punta drita or into prima in this case and thrust them. And you know, I mean, that's like classic Bolognese, right? Like Manciolino does that with a single sword, and so does Marazzo. So
And you see this exact play or some variation like persist probably until the 1800s. Right?
yeah,
Like,
and so
like it's just like it's not that rapier is and side swords are different. Like if we and I'm gonna preface that by saying if I think about the three Bolognese masters, that's what I'm saying is side sword. If I talk about those sources and I compare them to later rapier, like a lot of the stuff in later rapier sources is just kind of a subset of what the Bolognese sources of. It's just a distilled version of it, in my opinion. Right?
yeah, oh
It's
yeah,
like it's a very focused, it's a very like it's a very hyper focused version of like a slice of what the Bolognese sources contained. But yeah, those plays are beautiful. Like, especially when you see someone who can really fence rapier very well, and you see them execute stuff like that. It's a different view of a play that we're very used to seeing, right? Like you see a lot in Bolognese stuff. That provocation, that engagement, that that imbricata. Like it's just like a really standard thing in Bolognese. It's like maybe the Bolognese play. Do something, stab them with an imbricata.
yep, yeah.
And go from there.
So the cool thing about that play is the counter, though, because like the counter is super sick because essentially your opponent, having gone to parry the thrust after the beat, you know, they've got their sword in a position now that you're coming over the back of their sword at the false edge, and then as you wind up and to do that punta drita, all they do is just push their sword forward in guardia di faccia, and it'll just completely collapse the offensive person's structure.
That's
And
nice.
yeah, and it's crazy because usually you think about countering a thrust like that and you're going to think that you're going to turn your palm down and go into a punta drita or something like that. But here he's got his palm up and he's just literally just kind of throwing his flat across, and it's his flat that's dominating the line.
No, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's pretty trippy. It's trippy because you don't think that it's going to work until you do it, and you're just like, holy crap, this is amazing.
I will say that one of the primary like Bolognese defenses of when things are going poorly is it just go into Guardia to fetch it. Just go into Guardia to fetch it. And like like I'm in trouble. Guardia to fetch it.
Yeah. yeah. I mean, I think so. My very first day of teaching, because a lot of the people that I have for my sword and buckler class are like KDF folks that were interested in doing sword and buckler. So when the very first day, I was like, all right, now, if we ever cut a reverso, just assume that as we're exiting the play, you're going to go into guardia di faccia to cover your face.
Yeah, that's perfect. That actually works so well.
Yeah.
It's literally the greatest like oh shit maneuver like in all of everything that I've encountered. Just stick your arm out and hope for the best. At this point, if you're in that kind of trouble.
It is really the default oh shit for Bolognese fencing though, because you even think about it like, I mean, it's a counter to if somebody raises their sword up in alta, even if you're fighting with a two-handed sword, and you want to counter that, you might come forward with guardia di faccia. If somebody's kind of giving you that high cut.
I like to jokingly make the idea in my head that it was so successful that the Spanish just literally saw this and they designed their entire method of fencing around this one idea. They're just like, Guardia Fetch is so amazing, we're literally just going to design a style of fencing, and that's all we're going to allow people to learn going forward, is fighting from this particular card. Someone's going to listen to this recording and they're going to give me a hard time about that later. I know it. Someone in Destreza is going to give me a hard time later. I'm okay. I'll have that. I'll have that argument with him then.
Yeah. Look. I mean, it's not a Learte dell'Arme podcast without me ruffling somebody's feathers. So I appreciate you shouldering the burden for me on this one.
We can ruffle all sorts of feathers here. I unfortunately read a lot of sources that aren't Bolognese too, just so I can have arguments with people in other disciplines, you know.
Yeah, so actually let's rustle a couple of feathers because
So.
um I mean, I know I mean, look, I've kind of been on this journey of trying to think, okay, if I'm looking at Marazzo's two-handed sword section and I'm trying to understand it from their perspective, I think my perspective historically has always been that, um, you know, it's okay to look at the German sources and kind of get inspiration from them to try to understand what's going on in Bolognese two-handed sword. I know arguments that I had made in the past were a lot of times around the fact that there were German mercenaries throughout Italy, starting from the 1300s, and they didn't really stop. So what's to say that there weren't ideas of this concept of these actions like persisting throughout. Um, and I that aside, I mean that was generally my understanding of everything, but I know that for you, in the way that you kind of interpret Marazzo's two-handed sword, you do a lot of the falsos as descending cuts. So explain that to me and sort of give me a reason for why I'm wrong to go down this path and try to think of these things from this crazy perspective.
I think the simple answer is that there's no actual answer. And so I'm of the opinion that you should try them all and see which one you think makes the most sense within that particular context of that play, right? Because if we assume that the falso is always ascending, right? Then great, that's the position you take. But the minute you cross that line and think maybe this falso is like a Zwerkow, that opens your mind up to the idea that, well, maybe this falso is also descending, right? Or maybe it's actually descending and it's not squalembrato, it's like more of a fendente, right? And you're like, oh my gosh, I'm really going into weirdo German land now, not that Germans are weird, just that we've crossed this line from like what I think of is more the conventional, what people generally conventionally think the Bolognese do, versus the reality that combat is an ever-evolving metagame for pretty much all of history, right? Like, you even see this looking at Meyer. Meyer's literally taking like early KDF and Mediterranean fencing styles and kind of creating a whole new thing out of it. Um, and writing about it in a really different way. I don't think he cared as much. I feel like Meyer would be like, cool, whatever, like let's do the ascending falso, let's do the descending falso. It's all cool. And I don't know. I don't know if we have answers really for his more Mediterranean contemporaries in this regard, right? Like, I don't know if Marazzo would care. I know there are plays that feel like they could be more descending, or they could be more horizontal, right, as far as how falsos are delivered. And we see this all over the place, right? Especially in the stuff where Marazzo's really poorly describing something, which is most of that book, right? So, and all we can do is interpret and try. When you have things that aren't very explicit, that's my approach. Can you cut with it? Can you drill with it? Can you spar with it? Like, that's it. Those three things. If you can answer those three questions, then it's probably not a bad interpretation. Maybe one's better than the other for some context, and maybe you haven't quite figured that out, what that context is yet. But definitely, like, that's why I like to approach it. That was very. It's always been my approach. That's always been our approach here at Swordwind to these kind of things. Can you cut with it? Can you drill with it? Can you spar with it?
Yeah, and I mean you've successfully sparred with most of these things. I've watched you fight, and just
Most of the time it's like YOLO, let's try this out, let me see what happens. It's like it's in the book, I might as well try this in a tournament. That's what pools are for.
Yeah, exactly. But
I shouldn't say that out loud. I treat pools seriously these days, but like when I'm going through interpretive phases, I tend to treat my pools as like testing grounds of really non-compliant people for me to try out my interpretations on. So
I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's important.
Some people are going to be way more competitive about these things, and I'm just not. When it comes to pools, I'm not as competitively minded about it.
Right. So, I mean, have you been able to do a lot of this stuff in cutting? Because I know you guys cut all the time.
Yeah, well, we've been cutting less because COVID,
the great tatami shortage.
And then there's a great tatami shortage, which has been awful. But what people don't know is I have a giant stash of tatami in my garage that I've been using on my free time. And but no one come to my garage and steal that stuff because it's really hard to get a hold of. I'll be very upset.
Yeah, seriously, it's like gold now.
Come steal my tatami, I'm going to be a little disappointed. Yeah, and we were cutting that. We were some of these like descending short edge cuts to go into German land hit a bit worked perfectly fine. Like we never had issues with these. And then just continuing along that same kind of line of thinking with some of the, I don't want to say uniquely Bolognese because I feel like they're not terribly unique. They all kind of work. I can cut with all of them. I've been able to create drills, and a lot of these weirder like angles on falso, I've been able to pull off in competition as well. So I have a hard time saying anything is the way. In fact, I'm really scared of people who try to say something is the way, because I feel like the minute someone says something is the way, then they've closed their mind to the possibility that they're wrong. So I don't feel like that's healthy. I never feel like it's healthy for everyone to say like they figured it out, because I doubt it.
No, that's great advice. That's kind of the reason for going through this exploration now, because I think I started into in particular, I started working through the second assault of the two-handed sword, and I was just kind of, you know how in the second assault it's like Marazzo's writing gets like catastrophically worse.
It does, but then it gets catastrophically better.
And
I said that intentionally that way. But
the end of the second assault is just literally like a mind meld.
I feel like the second assault 10th chapter is literally all you need to know from the second assault. I feel like he actually meant that to be some like weird like 2.5 assault or even like a third assault, and he just like, nah, we'll just cram it into this last one at the end here. Because all those entries in I'll call it 2-10 describe how the rest of the second assault is kind of supposed to be executed in my mind. 2-10 is literally in my mind like what I think Marazzo was like, this is how to fight with a two-handed sword. You do an inverted thrust over the top, you cut from below, you grapple. Or, you go to Guardia di Entrare, you gain that overbind as you thrust over the top of their sword with a pass of your right foot, and then you do something. And I feel like I've really been diving into this a lot. 2-10 has really been influential in my long sword fencing lately.
That's awesome.
I feel like it's like the first assault and then 2-10, and that's really been like my bread and butter lately. So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's really good tactical advice in the third assault, I guess, sure. Or the guard section of the third assault.
There's all sorts of hidden advice kind of through there. Like, I don't want to call it, maybe hidden's not the best word. Less than advertised parts of that part of the book. There's a bunch of like cool little tidbits of fencing advice. I think there's actually some allusions to like Marazzo having a counter guard system. Like you're supposed to be in this guard when your opponent's in this other guard. He kind of talks about this a little bit.
Okay. So I actually, speaking of that, this is just a little nugget. All right. I'll bring that up later. We'll talk about that later. Let's keep talking about the two-handed sword. I don't want to get distracted here. Yeah. All right. Yeah. So that's really fascinating. So you're saying 2.10 because I feel like 2.7, 8, and 9 are the ones that are just like
Ooh, 9's
hot
beautiful.
garbage.
If you can get 9 down, like if you can get 8 and 9 down, they're really beautiful if you execute them well, and they feel super fantastic.
Yeah.
But they feel more like a flow drill than they are like we're trying to teach you something here.
Right.
I
Because
feel like
7
Go
isn't
ahead.
7 the one where you end up going and he's got the 3 different press A techniques essentially. Like you've got the one where you come in with a half sword, and then, or is that earlier? Is that number 6?
I don't remember. I'd have to
I
go look
can't
it up.
remember.
I'd have to
Yeah,
pull up my notes.
off the top of my head.
I do kind of have them in front of me here. He said 2-7.
Yeah.
I've got all my interpretation notes in front of me. No, you can't have them. No, I'm just kidding.
Jerk.
Yeah. So he kind of talks about in this one some of the same entering stuff that's in 210. Like some of that stuff's in there. That's like entering into Guardian Intrare and Cinghiale Porta de Ferro, which I think
Yeah.
Marazzo really likes using as your transitionary step from Gioca Larga to Gioca Stretta. Those 2 guards very specifically, I think, in the two-handed sword, Marazzo thinks is the cool thing to do when you want to get close to someone. Which makes sense, right? You know, if your default position in Marazzo is a Porta de Ferro guard, which a lot of times it is with a two-handed weapon, regardless of the source you follow, right? I would say the earlier German sources favor like Codalunga Alta kind of position, or right plow, right? Like there's that, but like Marazzo really favors this Porta de Ferro position, I think, specifically in the first assault. You're almost always in that guard when you start out, or you transition into that guard at some point before you execute your action. If that's the guard you start out in, right? If that's where you're supposed to be when you're far away, and if we also make the assumption that Marazzo really likes passing steps, which people who do like sources that are longsword based generally really favor passing steps. But then Guardian Intrare and Wide Step, and then Cinghiale Porta de Ferro, are both really how you would move with that, with that passing step. I have my right foot forward, I got to put my left foot forward, now I got to put my right foot forward again, right? And that in between stage is Guardian Intrare and Cinghiale Porta de Ferro. So, I don't know where I was going with that, but that was just on my mind.
That's pretty brilliant.
But
so
he talks about that a lot in the second.
It's interesting though, because like he also in the guard section he talks about, and I keep bringing this up, but he talks about how like you don't actually want to be in Guardia di Testa against somebody who's in Porta de Ferro. Like he says that you would want to go into Guardia di Testa if you're fighting somebody who's in Codalunga Alta, Stretta, or like Codalunga Larga. And so one of the guards, so it makes sense that he's using the feint, the fallaciare of the falso impuntanto, to sort of get the person who's in Porta de Ferro out of the guard.
And look at that transition right there, right? You pass your left foot forward. If you look at the first assault, chapter 1, right? Mm-hmm. You give that falso impuntanto auto pass of the left foot. Again, it's like literally the first chapter of the first assault is, let's do a passing step with a cover, and then get that provocation for another attack after it. Like right there, he's kind of telling you, I think this is what I want to do, guys. This is where we're going.
Strap in, because it's about to get weird, but just giving you a heads up now, this is where we're going.
Yep. Yeah, because he doesn't do a lot of that, and the rest of the first assault, there's not a lot of this passing step on the first action. It doesn't really happen. But it's interesting you talk about that guard, because in his counter guards, there's kind of a rule behind it, and I don't know if you've realized it yet. But whatever side your opponent's sword is on, like if their right foot is forward, then your left foot is back, and you're in one of those guards. And then you want to be in a guard where your sword is higher than theirs.
Yes. Okay. All right. So I'm gonna take us off on a rabbit hole here. Okay.
All right. I'm strapped in. I unfortunately don't have any wine, but I do have I can put a helmet on. I don't know where it is.
All right. So one of the things that I've been trying to do is take Manciolino's attacks and the counters, and plug it into Marazzo's middle chapter of chapter 2, right, or book 2, where he goes through all of the guards and then tells you to essentially learn how to attack and defend against from all the guards, right? So I'm just taking Manciolino's advice and then plugging it in there. So when I was going back through and I was looking at those plays in, I think it's Becca Posa, it's either Becca Posa or Becca Seza. He actually gives a list of actions that are his ideas for counter guards.
Yep,
So
that's
he
literally where I'm
says,
pulling this from. So
okay, all right, yeah. So if your opponent is in Codalunga destreza, he says to assume Becca Seza. And then if your enemy is in Porta de Ferro, he says to assume Becca Posa. And then if they're in Codalunga Larga, you assume Codalunga Stretta. If they're in Becca Seza, you assume Cinquiari Porta de Ferro. And then if they're in Guardia de Entrare, you go into Guardia Alta.
Yep.
Right. And so yeah, no, I've been playing with that a lot. So a lot of the sparring that I've been doing lately, I've just been trying to follow this advice and play around with different actions of like what these things sort of produce, because it is really interesting advice. I mean, some of them are pretty straightforward, right? Like Becca Pose against Porta de Ferro. I mean, that's just like literally setting up an imbricata. Like it's just like it's begging for it, right?
well, and you're setting yourself up really well, right? Like your sword's above theirs, kind of, right?
Yeah.
So you have that natural gravity on your side, to kind of, I don't have to do much. I literally have to just let my sword fall on the ground, and then
Yeah.
and I'm kind of safe. And then I'm keeping that side away from you, just to make that easier, so I can do a passing step with it and take that angle, or retreat back easier, kind of thing, and still be safe.
Yeah.
I love that whole
Yeah.
section. It's so underread, I think.
Oh yeah, I agree. He gives some pretty good nuggets in there, and that's why I was really interested to take something that was also from the Bolognese system and fill out the other information to see if it would even unlock some of that advice a little bit more. See if there was any more richer information there that I might be missing from just passing through and having him say, learn how to do these things without actually telling you how to do them, because he's Marazzo.
Well, exactly. Well, so if you really read through Marazzo, though, he does kind of have like a pedagogy framework, right? I don't know if I've ever shared that with you, where he kind of talks about like the order in which you should learn things.
Mhm.
It doesn't really go further than that, so it's not super. It's like I don't think you could design your curriculum based off of this, right? Not for each action. But he and
Right.
Delagoki share almost an identical, like a high level framework for how to teach people things. And one of those things is learn the defenses, right? So like the first step is like know the true edge and false edge of the sword. The second part is learn the basic offensive actions, so like all the cuts and stabs and thrusts and whatnot. But then learn the basic. After that is learn all the basic defenses. And he doesn't really go into the defenses too much, but I assume I assume that Marazzo had another book somewhere that was like, these are all my techniques for defending from guards. I say that jokingly. I don't know if he really did or not, but what we've been doing is like I teach in this order, but then I either reference plays from Manciolino or Delagoki for that particular guard and just do it with a longsword, and it works out really well. You want to learn how to fight from Codalunga Stretto with a longsword? Like you can do that.
Yeah.
No one fights from that guard. It's super powerful though. It's maybe one of the stronger guards. There's your secret technique. Fight from Codalunga Stretto. Keep your right leg forward and move your sword to the right. So there's some fun stuff that can happen there. But yeah, no, that's great. So how that's been working? So you've been teaching this, like, has been working well for you guys?
Well, I'm still working on building out this curriculum. Yeah. So I mean, I've just been teaching Manciolino's sword and large buckler, and then the attacks and the defenses from like his Manciolino's attacks and counters. And that's been going pretty good. I mean, people seem to pick up on it pretty well. I'm amazed sometimes at how many times, because I am working with primarily KDF students, how many times I'm like, oh, you know what this is a Duplirin, or like this is Zukin. I mean,
Yeah,
like
there you go.
it just like flat out, and they know exactly what to do. And I don't have to explain any further than that. So
Yeah, I find a lot of the guys who do like, and I'll just broadly say German longsword, pick up everything really well except footwork.
yeah,
Because the Bolognese really have specific footwork that they kind of work in. And whenever I teach someone who comes from like a German background, I always have to spend a lot of extra time teaching them that it's okay to cut over your your other leg.
your opposite leg.
Like
Yeah,
it depends on how dogmatic you are about that stuff. I know a lot of the better fencers kind of are just like whatever, they kind of do whatever makes sense because they've been doing it a long time. But people who've been like really dogmatic about following that, like, cut with your right, step with your right kind of format,
yeah,
really struggle when I say step with your left, cut from your right, or cut from your right, step with your left, kind of thing. It cracks me
yeah,
up a little bit. But
yeah. It is a little challenging. I mean,
well,
that has been my biggest struggle, is teaching them footwork. But Michelino is so like deliberate with his explanations of his footwork in the sword and large buckler material that it makes communicating it a little bit easier, because we can read through the play. And I mean, a lot of times it kind of makes sense, right? Like when you do that trailing back foot, because he does that sort of compass step where you've got that trailing back foot all the time after you've
yep.
done an action. A lot of times that pulls your sword away and sets up for a really nice slice. So like say you do a reverso to somebody's arm or something like that, and then you pull that back leg away, and you're just pulling your sword back across whatever target you've just kind of cut into, and just finishing with a nice slice. And he does that
really
all
love
the
that.
time.
I love that stuff too. I really love. I really like circular footwork like styles of fencing. And they're not super common, right? Like they do exist to some regard, but like they kind of get really overshadowed by outside of Spanish traditions. They get really overshadowed by more linear footwork, I would say. Um, Not that people who fence like rapier were like strictly linear, right? But they tend to be less and less linear as time goes on. Other than the Spanish, who take that whole circular footwork to some bonkers level, right? Like it's in a beautiful way, right? In a very beautiful way. They take it
Yeah.
to a very extreme kind of way of thinking.
Yeah, you're gonna walk around a circle until literally your point just kind of like happens to be in your opponent.
Yeah, yeah, sure. That's pretty much it. That's what it looks like anyway. The guys I do Destreza with, the guys I do Destreza with are gonna give me a hard time for saying that, though. I know it already.
I know it's more complicated than that. I'm giving you a hard time.
I know.
I mean, I think we're losing Steven right now to becoming a Destreza artist with his stringere interpretations, because he's getting really Destreza right now. But I don't think he's wrong. I mean, it's interesting because like what he's doing actually translates really well into what I've been reading in Palladini, where you're really kind of forcing your opponent to like one potential option, and that's just to do his falsata.
I'm gonna steal something. I think it's Marcelli who says this. Who basically says, the Spanish didn't invent anything new. They just reinventing what the Italians had already figured out, right? I think it's Marcelli. I think it's Marcelli who says this. And he's kind of right. I think in a lot of ways. I think a lot of that was super influential. That whole geometric fencing. I hesitate to say one person did it first, but an Italian did it first.
Thanks for the dramatic pause. I'm glad you emphasized that, just to make sure that there was no question as to whether or not you were biased. I appreciate
it. I tell everybody this. I really like Spanish sources too. I think I actually feel like a lot of the Spanish sources are probably a more natural progression from doing more Bolognese fencing than actually a lot more of the thrust, like more linear centric later Italian fencing is. I almost feel that way sometimes. Just we have with the floor diagrams, a lot of that stuff is very Spanish influence. I know a lot of other Italians are doing that too. Like Alessandro Senese has that stuff. Docellini has a floor segno as well, right? And So I hesitate to say it's uniquely like one culture or another, or one group or another. I think it was like a popular way of learning, but I feel like that's like circular
Yeah.
footwork styles and circular instructions all kind of follow a pattern, and I feel like the Bolognese, especially Marazzo, and I think even Mancellino a lot, falls into this kind of more circular fencing pattern as opposed to a more linear. Not that they're exclusive of each other, but just that they favor that a little bit more in one way than the other. So.
Oh yeah. No, I completely agree with that. I always think of, and maybe this is just because, Chris is my instructor, but I've always I've always thought of the Bolognese system as being circular. I mean, that's the way that he teaches it. So, um, you know,
I
I
went through
can't
a whole
imagine.
phase. Went through a whole phase just like him. Right, like I did all my assaults on the Senyo. Like I had like a tape on the ground. Like I had a whole like half I had a half circle in my back patio to my. I'm not sure my wife appreciated it too much, but there was a giant blue tape on my back patio where I would like circle on the ground with like triangles and shit everywhere, and I just
Yeah.
had at it with circular footwork, and I worked through all the assaults on there for a long time. And pretty much all of the Bolognese like plays will you can work them on the Senyo,
Oh yeah.
like
Yeah.
without much effort.
Yeah, Chris and I were doing let's see, what were we doing the other day? I think we were doing Dalagoke's forms on the Segno.
Oh, they
So
work
we were
perfect.
yeah. So I think we were trying to figure out the second one, but yeah, I mean, walking in the guards is a lot easier, but the second one we were trying to figure out how to do that.
I've been doing a lot of those like the thrusts on the beginning, the very first one that thrust and falso, I think it is.
Uh-huh.
I don't know. I
Yeah,
don't know how he words it specifically. There's a bunch of names for this thrust. I've been doing that actually with like a step across. So my
Oh
right
yeah.
foot, my right foot goes to the left triangle,
Yes.
and then on the other actions after the tramatzones, like just after that bit, when you step off for the first one, I step off to the right and I do a thrust, and then on the second one I do a step off to the left and then a thrust.
Nice.
And what's interesting is that honestly that's like Dolcellini's way of doing things.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, because he usually thrusts forward and then kind of retreats the back foot to the other line to
yeah,
sort of
like
pull off.
that's exactly what he does. Dolcellini has this whole idea that of the point basically, like it's their opponent's dominant shoulder, right? So if they're right-handed, you have your sword pointed at their right shoulder, and then you determine on whether or not you're the right or left side of their sword, or if their sword's on the left or right of yours. Excuse me, that's how he words it. And then you react from there, and it's always a step offline to the center with a compass step around to kind of reassemble yourself afterwards. So.
Yeah, so I mean, we always do that. I'm I even do that when I'm doing, Dalagoke's form more linear. Always get to step off to the side with that initial thrust, um, the Guardia Faccia thrust, or however it is. I can't remember what the wording is either off the top of my head.
Yeah, I'd have to
But yeah,
look it.
yeah. But yeah, I always do that. I always just feel like I have more leverage when I do that, especially in sparring. If I ever kind of go up into Guardia di Faccia, I'm usually sort of taking it off to the side a little bit with a little bit of a half step off.
Whether or
So,
not it's more effective or not, I do know you look a lot better while you do that, and that's important to
oh
me.
yeah, it's sexy. But I mean,
Yeah.
that is like 90% of Bolognese. I mean, let's be honest.
I know a lot of the Bolognese guys struggle with that sometimes, with the aesthetic versus like the function. This is like I've talked to multiple other guys who do their Bolognese fencing, and this always comes up in their head, like what they think what is the perfect form, right,
Mhm.
that we have from like the assaults versus like how sparring works out.
Right.
And it's you kind of have to compromise sometimes. Sometimes form like follows function, and sometimes the other way around. So.
Yeah, yeah, you got to find something in the middle. I mean, I have found that in my explorations of footwork and hip engagement, that using a lot more upright postures with my feet in terms of like actually picking my foot up off the ground allows for better hip transitions. So like if I were in Codalonga Stretta and I had my just the ball of my foot on the ground, if I wanted to transition quickly to parry to go into Porta de Ferro Stretta, dropping that heel down allows me to sort of turn, and it naturally turns my hip. So it makes for a really quick transition.
Yeah, and that's nice too, right? I feel like porte de fer benefits from being profiled more. And so when you make that pivot, you kind of turn your torso just a little bit into it, which I think covers you more, just slightly. It's one of those.
Yeah,
It narrows you just a little bit, which I think reduces your opponent's target just a little bit.
yeah. So I think that that's kind of an example of something where, you can think of something that oftentimes is a little bit more exaggerated, like picking up that heel up off the ground when you're forming Coda Longa Stretta or some of the other guards. But it actually has some utility to it. So
Yeah, you'll see that in later period rapier sources too, where they're like more back weighted, so that the front foot is lighter, and then you see that kind of go away a little bit, and it tends to be more centered. But then it kind of goes back to being more back weighted, depending on what sources you're looking at. I'll go back to Marcelli. He talks about really some interesting things with that. He has some interesting footwork stuff, and I highly recommend reading through that. I can't remember which one he's on. I haven't read it in a while. It's he either says be really balanced or he keeps that front foot pretty light. I think he keeps the front foot pretty light. It's been a while since I've studied Marcelli, but
yeah,
he does a good job of it.
That's actually something I found really interesting in Palladini. Speaking of sort of Bolognese sources, heretical Bolognese sources, perhaps. So he, with his beat, that terza beat that I was talking about earlier, the cool thing about being back weighted is you can get enough force with your sword by just transitioning from back weighted to front weighted with that beat to get a decent beat on somebody's sword without actually having to really move your sword.
Yeah, it almost turns it into a push cut kind of beat like action, right? So that you're coming down on top and almost skipping off into them. I hesitate to use those terms. Someone who actually fences will like critique me on that one. So, but someone who does like really like proper like rapier would critique me. No, that's interesting. I haven't worked through Palladini, so I'm looking forward to doing that at some point. I'm probably going to steal a couple students away on like a Saturday and work through it.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's cool though, but I just wonder how many of those things though, like talking about postures and overall placement of body mechanics and things like that, that we kind of miss from just, I mean, I guess we're starting to find some of them, or perhaps I'm just starting to find some of them in my own personal study, but I don't know, that transition. I mean, I kind of stole that from Chris. I think he's been, I can't remember who he told me to read. I think it's Saviolo. I think he's been looking at Saviolo a whole bunch. Hold on, let me grab it here.
Oh yeah, Saviolo's the Italian who moved to England at some point, I believe.
Oh no, he's looking at Alfieri. So he's been looking at a lot.
Alfieri's great. I love his Montante material.
Yeah, so he's been looking into Alfieri a bunch, really looking at his single sword stuff, and then kind of like mashing up a little bit between just seeing how that can sort of help inform Dall'Agocchie a little bit, which is pretty interesting. And he's come up with some pretty cool stuff. Just, I think it's inspired a lot by looking at the Anonimo and trying to figure out the certain actions in the Anonimo, because I mean that's, I think, had been his primary goal, was going back to Dall'Agocchie to then go back into the Anonimo to see what we could find. Yeah, so we've been playing around a lot with this sort of transition between back weighted to front weighted kind of stuff. It's interesting.
Yeah, and it shows up a bunch in like later period sources, like this really heavily back weighted. Someone tried to explain this to me where it was kind of safer, you kind of get your danger bits away, your head and your torso kind of away from the threat, and then that coupled with like more complex guards really keeps you pretty safe, compared to a much more squared format, right? Where much more of your torso is exposed. Yeah, no, it's interesting. I'd be interested to see your thoughts on this. Maybe if I come up to Oktoberfest, you can give me a lesson.
Well, Chris can.
Now you
I
both
can show you.
you both can. It'll be fun.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you guys can you can show me your destreza heresy, and I'll show you I'll show you our hybrid, like northern Italian sources, just like pulling everything together. We can we can set the whole Bolognese world on fire together.
No, yeah, I love the Bolognese stuff. That is my jam, right? Bolognese stuff is my jam. But someone once explained to me really succinctly that what the Bolognese are doing is not unique.
Right.
We just have a lot of good writing from this one location of Italy, of the Mediterranean, right? This style of fencing is like this really common all over the Mediterranean region, right? And I'm interested in that more like as a context thing, like were the Bolognese doing something different? Why was this so popular, right? But it always comes back to the Bolognese stuff for me, right? Like that is my jam. Okay. Like
Yeah.
I occasionally will I'll broach into some topic and I'll take some deep dive and I'll be like, what is Marcelli's Passo Scorso? And I'm like, oh, this is interesting. Why does he? So Marcelli is interesting because he talks very specifically about Delegoki being wrong. And he talks about he references him a lot actually as being wrong, which is interesting.
Oh man, we got to tell Stephen about
The
that.
Marcelli is throwing salt all over like Delegoki and setting him on fire at the same time. He's pretty harsh in his criticism, but I think it's good. I think it's an interesting view of why things are being done. So
yeah, all right. Well, paging Stephen Freitas.
why what has he been diving into? Has he been driving into
Oh, he's just.
all over?
I
He's
had
all
him
over the
on.
place.
I had him on the other day. We did a podcast episode, and he was just talking mad smack about Delegoki. So he's gonna love that. He says
Yeah, he will.
Delegoki. He says that Delegoki is the high school equivalent of like Bolognese fencing, compared to
What?
like the
No.
Anonimo being grad school.
The Anonimo is someone's poor like ideas like compiled into some mishmash nightmare of a notebook. It's like if if Delegoki is the high school book, which I don't disagree with, it's very basic. Delegoki is very great for teaching people basics. I'm going to say that the Anonimo is someone who is writing down really complex topics in really unorganized way. I don't know how to describe it. It's like, is this like the undergrad who doesn't really understand how to take notes, or what? Because the back half of the Anonimo is super organized.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Like I have a PDF where I've like put it all in order by guard, really well, very specific.
I did the same thing.
Not a PDF, a Excel doc, spreadsheet. And then I was like, yeah, I should do this for the rest of the book, and I was like, nope, that's way too much work. But one of my good fencing buddies, Ryan Neal, he was like, that's where all the good stuff is. All the good stuff is in the unorganized section, and I was like, figures that like in the rough, that's where the diamonds are,
Yeah.
But it's so much effort. It's just a slog to get through that stuff.
Yeah, well, I mean, he also gives us an explanation of what the falso impuntanto is in like 147 or 149 or something like that, which is the only time I've ever seen the falso impuntanto explained.
Barazzo does in the Sword Alone section.
Sort of. I mean, he says it's basically a tondo, right?
He literally says it's a tondo.
Yeah.
But
so here's the thing. Marazzo says it's basically a tondo, but then when you read the Anonimo, he says that it's all predicated on the half turn of the hand after you've done like a cut. So basically the cutting a mandrito and then turning the hand out, winding that hand out is the falso impuntanto.
That's interesting because Marazzo does that a lot too with the two-handed sword, where he throws that cut and draws the parry, and then fully inverts his hand for that descending thrust as they go up for the defense, which really is kind of like a false. Like if that's the description of it, and that's what you adhere to, then that's what that looks like to me in my mind. Like I'm throwing a cut, and then the minute you go to parry, I'm winding over and driving that thrust into you.
Right, which is
maybe.
It's not that different than the way that, I mean, again, going back to sort of explaining this to people who do KDF, like the way that I taught them the falso and puntanto. So we have a bunch of left-handed fencers,
Ew.
so I didn't want to leave them out.
Sorry. Sorry. I had to.
I know. They're so sinister, the evil bastards.
This is so evil.
Um,
I was actually really hoping my daughter would grow up to be left-handed, so she could make a living out of this or something, or have fun with it, at least in a different way. But,
yeah. So, so we have a bunch of left-handed fencers, and so I decided to teach them Marazzo's left versus right techniques. And so I did a deep dive on Marazzo's left versus right techniques. And when I was teaching the falso and puntanto that Marazzo does there, I found that the best way to teach it, and really the best way to use it in application, is to kind of essentially do like an inverted Zornort play, right? Like you cut strongly to the center over top of their sword, because you're cutting behind their sword, right? Because it's left versus right. And he says to cut over their sword. Like he emphasizes the fact that the cut has to go over the sword. He says it's important. And then basically as they start to parry out, that's as you start to wind. Except you're kind of inverting it because you're winding away instead of winding into it. But I mean, it's basically yeah.
It's basically cut with a wind to the upper right that thrusts down.
Yeah, and then as they parry out really wide, you just cut their leg because it's Marazzo.
So I'll go back to 210 here. He has one where you take the arms like a I forget what that is in German. You come under their arms.
Durchlaufen?
Durchlaufen, just like a Durchlaufen. And then you come in for it's either a reverso or grapple, or I think that's the option. Like you can hit him with a reverso or go in for the grapple there.
Nice.
But yeah, that inverted thrust after the cut, it's an interesting thing.
It is interesting. I mean, it's but yeah, so yeah, the Anonimo gives an explanation of that, and then
where is that?
Basically,
I haven't seen it. Where's that?
Yeah.
You said it's in one of the left-right sections.
Oh no, the play that I was talking about was from Marazzo's left versus right. Yeah, but the Anonymous section it's later. It's let's see if I can find it.
You can send me the number later.
Yeah, I will. I'll probably post it in in the show notes because I keep talking about it. And I've talked to Ken Harding about it. We had a conversation about it, but
yeah, Ken always has some great ideas about the falso and puntanto. He's got that little book that he has. There's his sources, his interpretation, which I think is really interesting. It's interesting to see what other people are thinking about that stuff.
Always, yeah, but so it's weird though, because then he'll give you this like. I think one time I took the PDF of the Anonimo, and I just searched for the falso and puntanto, and so that's where I got most of this information from. Just kind of looking at all of his plays for the falso and puntanto. But then he's got some of this weird stuff where like you'll kind of cut low, and you're kind of either cutting to their leg or their hip, and then you're doing a falso and puntanto that stabs them in the guts, which is pretty cool. But it just reads really weird. But he does say, and this is the interesting thing about the falso and puntanto, is he says that the falso and puntanto is never meant to land. It's always meant to threaten, but never really to land. It's usually used as a feint.
That's interesting. So it's like an Außer Mind in like German stuff.
Yeah. So
like
you're just kind of
like on that parry, you go for that outer winding to try to thrust behind it. But you're saying very specifically as a provocation more, which is interesting, because I think that's how Marazzo actually uses it in his 210 material. It's literally like thrust them this way so that they parry upwards, so you can do something else to them.
Yeah, it makes me think a little bit differently about Marazzo's like single sword progression, where he does that falso and puntanto and then the reverso back behind.
Yeah, no, that would make a big difference, right? Because if you're delivering that cut and you're assuming that it's parried and then you're thrusting around it, then as your sword came around, that would set up that reverso to the other side more. Yeah. That would make sense. I'm probably probably talking about it wrong, but it was
Well, yeah, so that, I mean, this is something that I've tried to conceptualize, right? Like if I start that out as just like cutting a really strong, almost like a push cut mandrito, where I'm just sort of cutting straight into the middle and then driving my sword forward, and they go to parry, they're going to turn their sword into porta di ferro stretta. And as they go to parry, I can wind out. And then as they parry out even further, because I'm winding out, then I can cut behind with that reverso.
Yeah, there's a couple ways you could do that too. Since your hand would be inverted, you could do like a tremazzone reverso, or if you're really into it, just full on tondo kind of reverso, like a full round kind of reverso. No, that's interesting. Now you got me thinking about. I'm going to be in my backyard tonight. Like
I know. Hey, speaking of your backyard, I was thinking about. So I forgot to ask you this, but when you were back there doing all your segno steps in the backyard, did your wife ever walk out and you were just like drawing like mythical symbols on your deck?
So I was not drawing angelic symbols on the floor like the cover of Marazzo. But it was literally just triangles. So nah, it stayed there forever too. I did it in blue painter's tape, so it wouldn't like cause a problem. So I could like remove it. But it actually lasted forever. Like the thing was on my back porch for like an entire summer and like didn't like come up at all. So
That's pretty impressive.
That painter's tape was really impressive.
What brand of painter's tape did you buy?
I had it set up with my someone a long time ago, and I've shared this information with a lot of other people since I found out. But someone had a bike stand where they would hold like a sword and they would do their actions on this. And I feel like I largely contributed to the spreading of this idea, like right after then, right at the beginning of COVID. I forget.
I have one too.
I just
was it Devin Borman? Because I think like I've seen so many videos of Devin Borman with his.
Now it's a thing. So I think I saw Jess Finley with it like a really, really long time ago. And then a buddy of mine, Richard, Richard Vang, he had he had one. And I was like, where did you get this idea from? He was like, I don't know. I found it on, he goes, I found it on like, on Facebook Marketplace or something like that. And, it seemed like it would hold a sword well, and it was a good idea. And the next thing I know, I'm like, everyone's like got one all of a sudden. Like I was like kind of like sharing this info with everyone I could, but I feel like everybody was sharing this info with everyone they could the minute they found out about it. And it trickled like pretty crazy. I see all sorts of people with it now. It's so useful. But I had it in the middle of my senyo, so like I could do actions with it while I was like walking around with it with like actual engagements, so I could kind of figure stuff out.
Yeah, it's been good. I enjoy using that as a pel. I mean, it's a good training tool. All right, so
we had questions. We had questions you were going to ask me. I feel like
I know. Well,
we've done sidetracked all.
I think we've covered a lot of these questions. Yeah. Honestly, I mean, through the course of our conversation, I like stream of consciousness. Look, I mean, how do you view the strategic and tactical approach to the Bolognese system?
I actually wrote something down for this one. I have notes in front of me because you sent me these questions. So thank you for that. I very specifically think that the strategic and tactical approach is really about that transition from gioco largo to gioco stretta. I feel like that's really what everyone cares about with Bolognese sources. On top of the tempo, right? So like the 5 tempi that are used to drive this kind of transition. Yeah. I think they really care about like being an outfighter and how you become an infighter, and what you're supposed to do in both, and how you're supposed to transition between them. And we don't get that, like I said earlier, in the earlier sources, like earlier German sources, we don't get that as much. It's more of what do we do at the gioco stretta. It was one of the things that led me to Bolognese. If we come full circle back to the earlier question, right? That was one of my questions. It was like, well, what do I do before then? How am I supposed to act before then? What should I be doing? Should I do what we see at tournaments where you see guys like with the sword in their shoulder kind of saunter up to each other and then assume a guard? Like that doesn't seem like I'm a great devil about to whisk someone's soul away. That seems like I'm just some like baker who's like out for a stroll, and happens to get into a fight. You know what I mean? So. Yeah,
that is perfect. So one of the interesting observations that I had going through Manciolino's attacks, kind of bring that back up, was that when Minciolino is in low guards, like in his general advice, he says that, the low guards are good for delivering thrusts and making parries. And if you look at his low guard sections for his attacks and his counters, all of them are either thrusts or, like, he actually follows his advice, where they're either, starting out with like a falso or it's a thrust from low guards. And then the high guards are the only things that kind of he actually does cuts from. And I was thinking about that, and Marazzo has this one bit in his sword and targus section where he talks about how if you watch, he gives you the advice, because he's Marazzo and his advice is scattered everywhere, but he gives you the advice to watch your opponent's sword. And he says that by watching your opponent's sword, you can always sort of divine what they're going to do. He says if they're going to deliver a thrust, they'll probably draw their hand back slightly. And if they're going to deliver a cut and they're in a low guard, because I think in the instance in that play, they're in like Codalunga Alta. And so they'll raise their hand in order to deliver a cut, right? And so in thinking about that and thinking about why Manciolino gives that advice, I think because the measure that those plays are supposed to be done from in Manciolino is going to be probably like in measure, and you don't have the time to raise your hand to deliver a cut from a low guard. So you're pretty much restricted. And if you think about that as a rule, in terms of how to approach measure and whether or not what actions that you can do when you're in a specific guard. So if you're in a low guard and you step into measure, perhaps your opponent steps into measure, you're really limited to what you can do, right? Or understanding that the potential for like creating a tempo is there. If your opponent is in a low guard, you understand that the shortest tempos are going to come from a thrust or perhaps a falso to the hand. However, if they do decide to cut at you, then they're going to have to give you a bigger tempo, and then maybe you might get that tempo from Delagokie where they chamber their cut.
Yeah, no, I think that's perfect. It's pretty much how I would sum it up, right? The closer you get, the smaller your tempo have to be, right? Or you're just you're in trouble, right? Like,
right, yeah.
Like, yeah, I'm sure there's exceptions, right? I'm sure there's people out there who are athletic enough to not care as much, right? But I think that's generally good advice. The closer you get to someone, keep your actions smaller.
Yeah.
Because the space is all constrained. Their actions too should be smaller. So you have to assume that as well. Someone actually made it interesting when I was at RASP last week, is how, like, any of those actions in which I can create a tempo for myself, sometimes, like, they limit my options, right? They limit what I have to defend. But at the same time, they limit your opponent's options as well, right? So it's one of those games where it's like, who's making the right decision here, I think, a lot of times. And if you can keep it small, you're always going to be ahead of the game, I think, for some of that stuff. Yeah, no, that's great. That's good insight. It's a good way to word it. I like you worded that really well. I really like that. So.
Well, yeah, I mean that's a recent revelation, so it's kind of fresh in my mind because it's something I've been thinking a lot about. And the only time from a low guard that he delivers a cut, well, at least that off the top of my head, is from Codalunga Alta, and he does it with a changing step, which changes measure, which gives you time to chamber the cut and deliver a fendente to the head.
Yeah.
So. Okay, all right, so we have your strategic and tactical approach to the system. Now, what is something that you think we as a community can improve upon to better reflect the sources in our fencing?
I think people should read the sources more. This is a discussion that happens a lot lately, is that people should read the sources more. I feel like we're kind of going to go through a phase of transition of fencers because of COVID. So we'll have people who've been around a long time who kind of just moved on to other activities, and if we want to kind of preserve what progress we've made so far, more people need to read the sources and kind of like preserve some of that. I'm super into the history part of it, like in preserving some of that. Like, I find that part really interesting. But yeah, that's it. Reading sources is my big one, and I think that the community can improve upon. Like the people who like do a lot of this stuff really read the sources a lot. People who teach classes a lot, I find like really read sources a lot. But I find like a lot of students sometimes struggle with this. I think, um, for better or worse. It's cool that we have instructors who can teach us stuff, but reading the sources kind of expands your mind a little bit. So,
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. I I I don't think that there's anything wrong with people learning fencing from an instructor and never touching a source, but it does kind of break my heart a little bit that people would get into this and not and follow that path, if that makes sense. Like,
yeah, that's
I'm
how I feel about it. That's exactly how I feel about it.
yeah, I just like I feel like it's the reason you kind of come to this thing. You want to understand. I mean, some people just want to learn how to historically sword fight, and I guess that's okay. But yeah, I don't know. The treatises definitely give you a window into the mind of the people who are writing at the time, and and maybe that is because both of us have a more historical approach, but it just like it satisfies the historical nerd in me so much.
Oh, yeah. It'll take you into like interesting paths too, right? Like weird bits of information, like the price of classes in like in Bologna at the time. Like I have a PDF, I have a document of this where I've like actually like wrote this down because I looked this up and I like did the calculations and did the conversions to like what is that in modern dollars? Like what does that look like? And yeah, no, I mean you miss out on some of those like fun little things, I think.
Yeah.
And then
So how much was it in modern dollars?
It comes out to about $100 a month.
$100 a month for Marazzo to be your instructor.
For Marazzo to be your instructor, which is pretty comparable to modern martial arts classes. Maybe it depends. It depends on the class. I was doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for a while, and like the price is pretty comparable to like what I found for that. You'll pay more obviously in like bigger cities, like but like I'd say $100 is probably an average price for most martial arts, somewhere around there, greater or lesser, just within that range. But I was super amused by that. There's like a whole section on where he gets like he basically is subsidized by the city too to like teach, which is cool.
Yeah.
Like I would never have known that had I not read all the sources and did internet research on it.
Well, you also get introduced to so many characters too, right? Like, I mean, I started reading about Giovanni della Bandineri because of Marazzo, and then just so happened to come across this one phrase when Giovanni della Bandineri is like right before he dies. He is pretty much tasked with sort of co-commanding with Guido Rangoni, and writes this letter to a friend of his and literally just bitches the entire time about how lazy and worthless Guido Rangoni and all of his men are. And and I just started laughing so hard, and then I thought to myself, wait a second, Marazzo might have been there.
Like, yeah, like these guys have personalities, right? And they have lives, like Marazzo has a son, that we know of,
Yeah.
Like all these masters have like other parts of life. It's sad that we don't have some of that information, right? It just doesn't exist, or it did exist and was destroyed just through the numerous conflicts in Europe from that time till now.
I want to know what kind of awesome textiles Marazzo made when he started his mill.
Right, he had his own business, right? Like what was he making there? I don't know. Like
I know.
Specifically,
was he making hats, making pants?
Yeah, I don't know.
Was he making pants for Meyer? Is Meyer really a pants catalog for Marazzo?
That's what I'm going with from now on. Anytime anyone asks me now, I'm just like, yeah, Meyer was just Marazzo's pants catalog. That's good. Keith will get a kick out of
that. I don't know. I keep getting in trouble by poking fun at Meyerists. Like,
you're supposed to, though, right?
It is our job. It is our job.
To,
Look, I'm actually really excited about the new Meyer, or recently discovered Meyer. It's not new. It's quite old. Recently discovered Meyer getting translated and out into the public, because I'm really interested to see what his take was, whether or not he knew what the Bolognese system was about or not. I'm really interested to see what his take was on the Segno and how he interprets that.
Have you read any of the other Meyer books?
Yeah, in bits and pieces. Yeah.
Meyer is awesome as a source. Meyer is, I don't know. His book is, his text is really excellent. The way he writes is really great. He took a lot of time like figuring out a way to like write this. Either by that was his training, or that was just the way he decided to do it. I don't know, but the way his text is organized is great. And his rapier section is fantastic.
Yeah.
Like it's really good. I think he did a really good job of combining what I'm going to call like general Mediterranean fencing styles with like a German approach. I think he does a beautiful job of this. Yeah, no, the text is great. So I highly recommend reading through Meyer. I used to joke around that Meyer. I always fantasized that Meyer was like visiting Bologna in the fall or spring as part of holiday with his family, and that's where he learned this, and they just took it back to Germany and made his own thing. But who really knows? It's just Meyer's maybe right now my favorite, one of my favorite secondary sources. Like after studying the Bolognese stuff, just looking through it, like that and the Spanish stuff are so like there's so many cool parallels there with just how people are doing things and how they're kind of writing things different and more organized in a better way. It's like you can see people's minds through these masters' writings becoming more organized over time, like with how they present this material. And it's super interesting to see to me. Like if you read Marazzo reads like a guy who's like pretty smart, but maybe not like the most highly educated, right? And you read like Mencilino, who reads like a guy who is like highly educated. He really wants you to know it.
Yeah.
Like writing.
Yeah.
And then after this period, like all the writing just becomes like really high quality, right? Like literally, like it's like 100 years passes, and everybody's like writing really well all of a sudden, like, and they're really organized and it's really well structured, and modern people can look at it and be like, wow, this isn't some weird, poem that I have to interpret or whatever. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I mean, literacy is an amazing thing. Though I do have to say that I think that your affinity towards Meyer goes back to something we said earlier, and it's your Swiss connection.
It's the meatballs.
Yeah, it's because he was born. Because wasn't he
No,
born
that's
in
Swedish
Bad?
meatballs, not Swiss meatballs. I'm gonna get shit for that too. Damn it, I said Swiss meatballs. Like, no, it's Swedish meatballs.
Yeah, it is Swedish meatballs.
I made the most American faux pas for these two countries. I can't think of a more American thing than getting those two countries like mixed up at this point.
Well, I mean, if we're being completely honest, in the 30 Years' War, there were probably enough Swedish people like in that area of Germany / Switzerland that, maybe they brought their meatballs with them.
That's terrible. You should cut that part out. Just ignore that entire. Or leave it in now. I don't know. It's funny now.
Oh yeah, no, I'm gonna leave it in. All right. Well, any final thoughts?
No, but this is great. It's interesting. I actually just started listening to your podcast maybe like a month ago, and I started going through all of them, and I've almost caught up. So I'm pretty happy to actually be a part of all this. Really, I think this is a cool thing you're doing here. I think it's cool.
I'm happy to have you on here.
This is the other thing I think people should do is I think we need more content as a community. Like this is great. I think what Martin's doing is great right now in Germany.
Oh yeah.
His videos. I've literally had so I was at an event recently. And people kind of know I do Bolognese like stuff, now. I probably had like 10 people come talk to me about his videos.
Oh, nice.
uh,
Yeah.
because they're
No,
like
he's
they're really well done. So I'm really happy with that. More content is always good.
yes. Yeah. No, he's doing a fantastic job. Um, it's great to talk to him and kind of get his mind. So yeah, I'm excited. But I mean, it's good. We're growing, and it's good to sort of highlight the different people who are out there. All right, man. Well,
Good luck.
yeah. Have a good night. I'll talk to you later.
Yeah, man, it was fun. Maybe I'll see you at Oktoberfest. So we'll see.
Sure. Sounds good. And that concludes another episode of L'Arte dell'Arme, the Bolognese podcast. I want to thank Pike Pullen again for coming on and having a great time. Learned so much from this conversation. His approach to two-handed sword is really unique and awesome. And I love that I can kind of build this conversation out and provide a little bit of context to different sides of how we should approach this material. I hope it's been refreshing for you all, and I hope that it helps you in developing your interpretations. I can't thank Pike again enough for just really sharing his general fencing knowledge and wisdom. There's so much good stuff in this episode that I'm really excited to share with the greater Bolognese community. So, um, again, to Pike, thank you so much for doing this with me. Um, there should be another episode next week of Le Arte dell'Arme, the Bolognese podcast. So stay tuned for that and stay saucy, my friends.